La zona blanca.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's show. We're bringing you a discussion on shame. Shame and depression. The link between shame and depression isn't obvious. Quite often within the community, within our own society, we're ashamed to admit things like depression, which are mental health issues, in fact. That's how they're graded. And often we're very, very reluctant to deal with these issues. And Ahlebait TV has been running a series of programs around the issue of mental health and how we can cope with it. It comes in many shapes and forms, but the form which we're going to discuss today is the one which is a result of shame. I have with me Mr. Bilal Ali, who's a professional psychotherapist. Welcome to the show, Bilal.
Thank you, brother. Assalamu alaikum, brother Musin.
It's really quite rare that we get a chance to have specialists who come in and discuss these issues. And on this occasion, I'm very thankful to Brother Bilal to raise this issue and to try and help define it. Obviously, the ulama have their role in trying to help communities as well, and we'll be getting their opinion a little later in the show as well. But to get the ball rolling, Bilal, what's the concept of shame? First, the definition of shame.
Okay, in Western academia, shame comes in a number of forms, or is defined by a number of different disciplines. So you got in terms of philosophy, it has its definition, psychology, anthropology, so on and so forth. The perspective one is tending to lead to, in a psychotherapeutic sense, is dealing with like from a psychological point of view. So the regular Oxford Dictionary or Chambers Dictionary, you know, talks about humiliation, a consciousness of falling below the standards of the group, or bringing shame onto the group. So in that kind of context, we're talking about a emotional pain, and where the self is judged, as opposed to, in contrast to something like guilt, where we look at a person, we're looking at their actions.
So that's a very, very broad definition. I think that pretty much everybody at some stage in their lives has suffered from shame.
For sure. Yeah.
That seems absolutely obvious straight away from the definition you've given. This idea of humiliation interests me. Humiliation in the context of Islam and Muslims and their practice of their faith is a very interesting thing, because Sharia is very specific. You know, not being able to pray on time, perhaps not being able to fast, not being able to do a lot of the rules and regulations could cause shame. Could be a person could be ashamed of not being able to fulfill their obligations to Allah. Now, is that something that you can expand on for me? Because I have got other questions around this.
Sure. Well, first of all, while we define shame, we could say that there are different types of shame. There is shame which is, in the colloquial sense, which is, you know, a form of embarrassment, or a feeling of being uncomfortable, being self-conscious, being aware that one is falling below certain standards that is set by the group, or that one has set for oneself. But then it becomes pathological if, and you know, and something that is on a deep psychological level, if it becomes compounded, where the person becomes almost like incapacitated, where they remove themselves from the gaze of the others and they isolate themselves, then it's a different type of thing. But it is healthy to have a sense of, you know, it wouldn't be cool to do that, or I couldn't be seen to do that. You know, shame has a positive element in that it promotes pro-social behavior, you know, in the group. And this is something that exists in a number of societies. In fact, most societies throughout time. I guess some of the sheikhs would say when things exist throughout all times in all societies, then we say it's part of the fitra. So I guess we could possibly argue that it may be part of the human condition, irrespective of time and place.
So on the one hand, there's a positive aspect to shame. It helps to limit your kind of actions which may go beyond the pale of Sharia, or beyond the pale of ethical and moral behavior.
Yes.
To be ashamed of doing something bad is a good thing.
Yeah.
But shame when it goes out of control, and shame when perhaps people begin to use the hardship of another, the shame of another, to manipulate that into either judging them, with an intention to oppress, well, that would be an example of how shame is kind of open to abuse.
Sure.
By brother Muslims as well.
Yes, by family, people who know us well, people we're vulnerable to, or people from our, let's say, we see the Ummah as a international and global family or global nation, but at the same time, we're talking about community now on a smaller level, where it's more local, where it's more intimate, and people know specifically about people. That's when the issue of shame can become problematic. And he said people are open to bullying, to manipulation, to find themselves marrying, for example, or staying in marriages because of shame. Not they're unhappy, it may be abusive, it may be unhealthy, but the pressure from outside dictates. And then we say, what is the standard of the group? That's what's in question. Not the fact that certain acts would be inappropriate and that you're influenced by your peers. Nobody likes to lose face in front of their peers. Nobody. But what is the standard of the peers? That's when Islam and Muslim become something separate, and we have to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So it's a very delicate balance here, and it's a very important aspect of our own selves as human characteristic, because often why I find psychology so fascinating is that people often don't know themselves, which is a fundamental issue. People also don't often analyze those very basic aspects of our human characteristics. For instance, just thinking about opposites of behavior, the opposite of wisdom, which is a positive attribute, is ignorance, or the opposite of generosity is tight-fistedness.
Yeah, miserliness. Yeah,
miserliness.
Yeah.
Now these opposites are important things for young people to look at as well, to analyze and to think about. But let's stick to shame within that context. What's the opposite of shame? I'm just trying to wonder what the opposite of shame is.
In an abstract sense, we could say pride, but pride as a loaded term in Islamic terminology. Not pride as in kibba, like in the Arabic word pride, but maybe we use a pride like honor. Say for example in Japanese culture, if we're looking at it transculturally, so shame in a collectivist culture has a positive element because it's about self-criticism, but not self-criticism to the point of annihilating the self, but self-criticism of reflecting and a pathway to self-improvement. So not a pathway to bullying by others, but for you to, it's used in that culture in some spheres to internalize, where was I, who am I, where do I need to be, what steps do I need to take to get to that next level.
And it's very clearly linked to what the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seems to reiterate over and over in the Quran, is that reflect, think about yourself. So being ashamed is a process of reflection.
Sure.
And so in that sense, the idea of reaching taqwa, reaching piety, a pious status, or attaining piety, a level of honesty and integrity within yourself, definitely requires a degree of shame, humility.
Yeah.
I'm connecting shame now to the concept of humility.
Yeah.
So the difference between humility and shame is again quite subtle, but it's connected. There is an interconnection.
For sure. I think even although we're jumping from language to language, as in English, I think humility and humiliation are etymologically linked in some sense. But it's almost like, instead of it being, because you spoke about opposites, we could even look at things in a sense of, instead of black and white, more like on a continuum. So at one end of the Richter scale, we find shame, and its most extreme, it's pathological, and like I said, it leads to people developing other mental health conditions, as in terms of becoming depressed because they're experiencing shame, intense shame for long periods of time. This can lead to people becoming depressed. They're susceptible to aggression and anger, lashing out at those who they may feel have shamed them. So there's things like that on one end of the scale. But on the other end of the scale, or the continuum, is a humility where one is humbled before God, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and would feel bad about having committed certain things or thinking to commit certain things, that this is what would preclude one from transgressing the laws of Allah, sort of thing.
Sure. I mean, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that there is a yin and yang situation here. It's a two-pronged sword, this idea of shame. I'll come on to depression, which you've raised as a consequence of the pathological kind of shame, or maybe through the bullying kind of effects that might be linked to people who are ashamed, i.e. if somebody finds somebody is ashamed, they see it as a vulnerability and a weakness and then exploit it. We'll come on to that, into the way communities and society maybe use these things in a negative way, or create negative effects for themselves as a result of the feeling of shame. But let's go back to the Abrahamic faiths and their views of shame. The Talmud has a take on shame and humiliation.
Yeah.
What is that?
From what I know, I think the Talmud in a number of places I have cited. I did a dissertation on shame last year, completed a dissertation on shame last year, and the Talmud speaks in one place that humiliating another is something equivalent to the shedding of blood, you know, or it's the shame is in another place in the Talmud. It quoted like shame is painful beyond like physical pain, basically. But the shedding of blood one is the one that really stuck home for me, as it's true that when people are, this is a link to aggression, because if somebody is felt that they have been shamed by another in public and they've been being dishonored, things of this nature has led to, in societies, in civilizations throughout time, has led to duels, has led to violence, has led to death because of words, basically.
Sure. And in terms of other Abrahamic examples, within Christianity, the idea of shame comes up quite regularly within their scriptures as well. So it seems to be as part of the ethics of the Abrahamic faith. It's a consistent issue that comes up.
I think the word shame is of Germanic origin, schema, and it's something related to being exposed. So this is where you have I think it's a 17th century painting or fresco, as they call it, of the European depiction of Adam and Eve and the fig leaf, and the whole concept of nakedness. So I guess that's where the sort of Christian side of shame comes in. This whole thing about being exposed.
Adam's awareness of himself, as if Adam's awareness of himself. That's their version. But yeah, I mean, moving on to again shame within the Quran and shame as perceived by Muslim communities, particularly Muslim communities living here in the West. There's one thing that makes us more conservative. It's living in an environment which is often seen to be threatening.
For sure, yeah.
Because you're a Muslim, you're living in a society which is atheistic or secular, constantly attacking perhaps your beliefs. You are the other quite often. So in these situations, some young people might become ashamed of being Muslims, you know, having to wear hijab, for instance, having to behave in certain ways, having to not eat certain foods, and then that making you different from other people, standing out, and becoming then a target. People could then turn on you and say, because you're different, they make you become, you know, they try to create complexes within you, and you become ashamed. As a child, I can see that would be a very vulnerable situation.
Potentially very vulnerable situation, because if we think about it, for teenagers, young people, teenagers coming into a self-awareness where at that time the person, male or female, young boy, young girl, they're just developing their own independent ideology, self-concept, where they're actually defining themselves and discovering themselves independent of their parents' views and morals. I think that this is the kind of age group where you find a bit of rebellion or a bit of let's say resistance, just revolting basically, because they're trying to really define themselves. And at that time is a high level of self-consciousness, and as you said, the peer pressure to fit in. You know, why are you fasting for? Well, come on now, you know, or don't you want to have a drink? Or what kind of weird thing is that then? I mean, I know I can understand a long time ago they used to cover their hair because of the sand, but why you got to cover your hair like that now? Do you want some lipstick? Or, you know, so it's, the peer pressure can be immense for young people, and they can experience shame. It can even be sectarian, you know, like if you're a member of a denomination that is a minority, then you could become a minority in a secular society.
And how would that sort of a
goes on.
situation create depression within a young person, perhaps, young Muslim?
Potentially not having anybody to confide in, ruminating, feeling ashamed to be, or finding it difficult to be in certain company, so isolating oneself slowly, systematically, avoiding the outside world. And the shaitan gets in, the wiswasu gets in, and it just compounds the, I guess, genuine questions. But once you're in isolation and you ruminate, then it's basically a bad concoction, you know.
So, okay, there is this negative impact that begins because somebody may be bullying or picking on a young Muslim for his beliefs.
Yeah.
He keeps those things inside him, and he's becoming ashamed of perhaps being Muslim because he may not actually believe in the faith in a way which he's rationally thought through.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where I'm seeing vulnerability, that if there are young people who are just told that Islam is the way and that you have to believe in it, and it's just something culturally and, you know, communally, it's the done thing.
Yeah.
If they haven't questioned their Islam, if their Islam isn't strong at that stage, they could be vulnerable to shame.
Yeah.
And the shame could then lead to this crisis of identity and subsequently depression. Now, having established that, what are the symptoms that parents should be looking out for, perhaps, with young people who might be suffering from this kind of?
I would say that one of the main alarm bells is when people start to physically isolate themselves, when people start to lock themselves away. Families having a meal, they tend to find a particular sibling is on their own in their room. They don't go out as much as they used to go out. They appear low in mood, like as in physically, they make poor eye contact. Yeah, things of that nature are kind of not, let's say, a diagnosis of any kind of clinical nature, but just kind of clues that something's not right. That, you know, there could be young person could be experiencing some kind of problems and could do with you know, somebody to listen to, or they need to speak. And it might be difficult for them to speak to their parents. They might be viewing themselves negatively, saying that not only have I got a crisis of faith, which I definitely shouldn't have, and what kind of person or human being or Muslim am I that I didn't have all the answers to these guys, and why aren't I stronger in Iman? And so they may actually take it out on them, you know, internally take it out on themselves.
Yeah, I mean, moving along, I mean, we've talked about the young people and perhaps some of the symptoms that might give away to parents that a child is suffering from depression or feeling down because of guilt and shame. There are other things that within their family context can create shame. Mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws. You know, that's another collision area which comes up regularly. And especially girls that are brought over from other countries, other environments. They come into a British environment. They've got all those challenges, and they're perhaps made to feel ashamed.
Yes.
Of the fact that they're not quite what they were expected to be, perhaps by the in-laws, and then the shame of not living up to that, and relationship with husbands, etc., perhaps who are maybe manipulated and controlled by in-laws as well. That could be an area of shame.
For sure, for sure.
And how do people like that? How do individuals in marriages? And often this is an issue, that there's a lot of breakup of marriages now amongst the Muslim community, very much like the secular society. We're going down the same road, and I see shame as a factor within some of those breakups, not being able to live up to the standards.
Yeah,
as you said.
And more troubling though, there are those who stay in abusive relationships, both male and female. Not only sisters are in you know, bad situations in marriages, but generally we are more sensitive to our sisters. But you know, people stay in abusive relationships because of the social impact that would have of divorcing, and what would it say for the name of the family. So then you juxtapose that with your own psychological health and well-being, and then you stay in a situation which is totally not good for you.
Well, it seems to me again that, I mean, I've raised a couple of examples, but it's probably clear to the audience by now that actually this shame factor can happen because of your exam results. You could be ashamed of, I don't know, you could be ashamed of your cultural identity. You could be ashamed of going to a certain school. Shame is just lurking around every corner, it seems. The potential for shame.
Yeah.
And the negative perceptions of shame are of real vulnerability. How do people conquer this? What's the solution? What's the antidote?
Well, I would humbly suggest that we find ourselves in difficulties and challenges, and it's easy for us to try and reinvent the wheel. But then we come back to the Quran, and we come back to the Sunnah of the 14 Ma'asumin alayhim salam, and then we think, what is the standard and the criteria of judgment which is given to us through the Quran and through the lives of the 14 Ma'asumin alayhim salam, and then we find liberation possibly in understanding their lives and the things that and the standards that they set, and we can find a liberation in that. But I mean, I'm giving you in a nutshell, but I mean, I'm talking about deep reflection and sitting with the shiuch and those who really understand and really have a good insight into different areas, and sitting down and questioning them, and taking away the information and reflecting on it, and taking it to a different shiuch, for example, and juxtaposing different questions, and you know, trying to really, but ultimately it means coming back, because you live with your own, on an existential level, we live with our own thoughts, we live within our own world. Yes, we're part of a collective, but in our quiet moments, or even in the crowd, only we are there with our insecurities, with our fallibilities, with our confidence, with our doubt, self-doubt.
Well, it seems to me that again, dua and prayer are often limited as a cure within our own minds. Prayer as a meditational exercise, prayer as a reflective exercise, dua as a reflective and asking
For sure.
action,
Yeah.
A request. I think it's important to bring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala back into the equation here, that actually there are direct lines for you on that self-reflection stage to start having that communication with the Sublime, and asking for his support, and asking for
no doubt.
his support in those problems. But then the reflection, if you're an intelligent person who reflects and inquires and has that relationship, would you be able to touch aspects of your own personality and character to realize that you have lots of positive qualities? And if, say, for instance, somebody else is causing the shame in you, or a situation is causing shame within you, to rescue yourself through all the positive attributes that God has given you, to understand that perhaps you're not what people are putting you down about. And perhaps often when people are putting you down, it's more a reflection of their weakness than yours. That's not to say you fall into arrogance and try to say, well, nothing wrong with me, you know. And there's that fine line between totally denying there's anything wrong with you, but if you do reflect and you find that somebody's trying to make you ashamed about something which you don't need to be ashamed about, then at that stage you've got to understand that it's actually their oppression. It's actually somebody who is being zalim upon you. But if what somebody's saying about you, or something that somebody's advised you about, has some truth, when you reflect, will you realize there is some truth and I should be ashamed of this thing that I've done, then you should change yourself.
Well, there's always room for, you could say there's always room for self-improvement. Something sprang to mind when you were speaking. I had a thought that ultimately, no one really has the ability to make us ashamed. That we do it to ourselves because of our own internal locus of evaluation, our perspective, how we interpret the comments made by others, the statements, it could be being snubbed, whatever the action is, or failing an exam, or whatever it is. It's our own internal locus of evaluation which ultimately leads to us feeling ashamed. There's a trigger, an event, we analyze that event, we have an interpretation of it, and then the emotional response is shame. So we need to, one would benefit from changing that appraisal of a situation, of what it really means. It could be a failure in a particular area, it could mean Allah is giving you a test. It's a road to a deeper learning, things of this nature. But there's no need to be ashamed where you're judging your entire self as bad, and that, you know, yeah, ultimately it is about our relationship with Allah and communicating with Allah. And when you mentioned reciting the dua, I think that the duas of the Imam are so powerful, but sometimes we would benefit from maybe trying to reflect on them, the lessons that we're getting from the actual duas, as opposed to just asking, but understanding as well what is being said, because there's so many lessons in the actual duas of the Imams.
And you talked about cross-cultural aspects about, you know, shame. Can you expand on that a little, Bilal?
Yeah, so in, say for example, there's a professor, June Tanji, I think from the United States, who's written a lot about shame, and she cites in one piece of a particular piece of literature about cross-cultural elements of shame. So she speaks about shame having in the Far East, in places like Japan and certain Asian societies, has an element linked to honor. So, and as I mentioned earlier about, you know, it's a pathway to self-improvement. You can also see elements of, because they say that, I think it's in psychology and sociology, they talk about cultures being divided into shame cultures and guilt cultures. So Islamic cultures tend to be shame culture orientated. You have places, societies like in West Africa, again, where pride, family, honor of the clan is a kind of guiding principle, and impacts on people's behavior, because it's not me as an individual, but because I'm from a collectivist society. That means when I marry a young lady, I don't just marry a lady, but now our two clans or our two families are now marrying. So it's a wider implication for me to mistreat her is bringing light on my whole family. So this is where, you know, it has some positive elements, but then there's always that room for oppression, because it depends on what the standards are of the family or the clan.
It is. Shame is a double-edged sword. Let's bring it back in conclusion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and, you know, our relationship with Him, and the shame of not fulfilling basic obligations. That He having given us so much, every breath you take, every sound you hear, you know, every kind of leaf you
senses,
see.
yeah.
You know, these are all gifts. They're all gifts that you, even if you worshipped and said Subhanallah for the entirety of your life, you couldn't repay the value of all that's given. But that's not a reason to be ashamed, that if we can't necessarily live up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules and regulations. I mean, I'm going to come specifically. I mean, people start missing their namaz on a regular basis, or if they start missing certain actions. I've seen people who get very, very depressed and they're sort of battling with it. But surely isn't that part of the battle and the journey back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You will have failures, you will fall and you will rise. Yeah. But it's not something to be ashamed about necessarily.
You'd be regretful about certain things, but shame to become isolated to, I've missed one prayer at the mosque, so I don't go to the Jama'ah no more because I feel bad about certain things, or, you know, I start to pull myself away. Once the Muslim's isolated, it's as I said, it's an inroad for the shaitan. But also, I remember a sheikh told me once, years ago, and it's stuck with me for many years. He said, the believer is never hopeless. The believer is never hopeless, that Allah will leave him. You know, so even if we've made errors, we can accept ourselves unconditionally, but we don't necessarily unconditionally accept our actions. So we're trying to reform our actions. But in essence, if we're Muslim, we believe La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, then we say we accept ourselves as Muslim, and that I won't be perfect, I will be fallible, I may err from time to time, but Allah is the all forgiving, the all merciful. And the verses where Allah speaks, the ayats of Quran, when Allah speaks about His mercy and Him opening the way for us to come back to Him, are numerous. And Allah speaks about punishment and wrath, but these are contextual. So Allah's really saying, you know, the 113 of the 114 surahs of Quran talks about the name of the beneficent, the merciful, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. So Allah's letting us know that He is, to put it colloquially, He's there for us.
So there is always hope, and I think the Quran confirms that, you know, losing hope in the sublime is a real no-no. Yeah. You've always got hope, and no matter what you've done, I think that whether it's you're feeling shame or guilty or
depressed, whatever it is, Allah can heal.
Yeah, inshallah. You've heard our first discussion in a series of programs around the psychology of Islam, and you can see how it relates to our everyday lives and how often how we do things is not the only issue. It's why we do them, and perhaps why we don't do them. It's also very important to reflect upon. And Islam is not just a set of rules and regulations and how you do certain actions. It comes up often, especially when we ask ulama questions about Sharia or what our obligations are. What we also need to do is ask why. And the why often leads to understanding also the ethics and the morality behind Islamic values and ideas. And really important to understand those, not just to understand the outer exoteric actions, but to understand the depth and the reason why we do things. Inshallah, we'll have more discussions around the psychology of Islam in future discussions. Thank you for joining us for this particular series. Assalamu alaikum.
La zona blanca.